screen. Please give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen. Thank you very much. So once again, welcome everyone for joining. Thank you for making time to join us today and listen to our presentation. I think to kick us off, I'd like to maybe call on Blaise to give some primary or foundational introductions regarding the paper, and we can proceed from there. Over to you, Blaise.
Sorry, Blaise, we can't hear you.
Yes, we can hear you, Blaise. Oh, we still cannot hear you. I think he's having some technical difficulties. I think he has jumped off, and we'll jump back on in a few minutes. So I think I'll just go ahead and give some preliminary introductions around the project, and when Blaise jumps back on, he can take it from there. So I think we are looking at primarily this paper stems from a project we've been working on with the African Center for Economic Transformation since 2024, last year. It is a multi-year project, a 3-year project, looking at how we could utilize artificial intelligence and its methodologies to support fiscal and monetary policy making. So ideally, this means looking at, is Blaise back on? So ideally, this means.
Can you hear me?
Okay, yes, we can hear you now.
All right.
You can go ahead.
Yes.
Okay. So I was just giving preliminary information around the foundation of the paper. So this means using AI to support fiscal and monetary policy making. This includes working with various Ministry of Finances in the countries. The project we have currently established this in about 4 countries: Nigeria, Ghana, Togo, and South Africa. And each of these project has a specific use case, which we might also be discussing on this call. So I think this is the foundation for where this book chapter stems from, and us trying to look at the gap of how transformative, ethical and responsible AI can be from the lens of AI sandboxes, primarily for economic policymaking. So I just gave a foundational background of where the paper stems from. So maybe Blaise wants to give a full or more detailed overview. Over to you, Blaise.
All right, thank you, Olamide. What I was saying is that artificial intelligence is rapidly changing economies and societies worldwide, yet its development in Africa raises very foundational critical questions about ethics, responsibility, and inclusivity. Ensuring that AI serves the continent's development priorities requires frameworks that balance innovation with accountability. AI sandboxes, as my colleague may have touched on, as controlled environments for experimentation and regulation, offer a more promising pathway to testing ethical principles and practices, fostering trust, and align our technological process with Africa's socio-economic transformational goals. This book chapter seeks to discuss AI sandbox frameworks and its adoption in Africa, making us traverse this path in a safe and ethical way, whilst deriving the benefits of AI, making sure it is inclusive for all segments of the society. Using case studies and best practices from fintech sandboxes in Africa, where we have some success stories, and other global AI governance frameworks, we propose some pathways for holistic AI development in Africa in the book chapter. At this stage, I'll call on my colleague Olamide to take us through the first part of the presentation, after which I'll follow with the second part, and then we'll take question and answers, if any. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Blaise, for setting the scene for us. So without further ado, just jump straight into it and give more background and context in addition to what my colleague has said. So apologies if I'm looking at two different screens because I have my biggest screen up here. So I think over the past few years, primarily, the rise of AI has been exponential, particularly also in Africa, and it is no longer like an abstract context. And across the continent, there has been, adoptions, development, and it's really accelerated, in the recent years. And, this is primarily being driven by several factors. One is the growing technological literacy among the young people, the youth, and, also increased investment in the innovation ecosystems. They could be from, African government, it could be from international donors. There's been a rise of this in the past few years, and even, private sector involvement as well. And there's also been, particularly recognition by governments, private actors on what, AI can address and how it can address socio-economic, challenges, range from healthcare to agricultural productivity to financial inclusion and to, public service efficiencies. And also we've had, major countries, we've seen Kenya, South Africa, Nigeria, Ethiopia, which are emerging as regional hubs, and they're hosting AI startups, research centers, university programs, and so on and so forth. And this development primarily has pointed, to Africa's growing stake in the global AI landscape. I mean, earlier this year, I think in April, there was, the Global AI Summit in Kigali, Rwanda, which was massive and had so many, participations around the world. Well, as promising as all of this is, it presents dual challenge, like a dual challenge. On one hand, we need to encourage innovation and leapfrogging. We've seen in the cases of fintech, like my colleague said. But on the other hand, we almost also guide against deepening already existing inequalities, data sovereignty, and replication of global biases in local systems. And in academia and policies circles, there is now an expanding discourse on the transformative potential of AI for development. However, Africa's path towards building an agenda that is both ethical and at the same time responsible is still growing and very underexplored in so many different ways. And I think most strategies remain high level. We see country level AI strategies, we see country level some country level AI policies, but there might very be little attention to practical implementation of principles of equity, inclusivity, responsibility, and so on and so forth. So which is why we also proposed this, argue that it is not just enough for Africa to adopt AI, right? It must chart its own course, by embedding ethical and responsible principles, as the foundation. Otherwise, we risk importing, not only the technology, but also, the unintended harms that come with it, which includes privacy breaches, algorithmic discrimination, and exclusion of vulnerable groups. And by examining, the role of regulatory sandboxes in economic policy making primarily, we seek to show, how like controlled environments such as these sandboxes for experimentation can help Africa test innovations while, still protecting societal values. So to just sum it up, sandboxes may allow policymakers, to shift from reacting after problems emerge to, proactively guiding AI development in alignment with ethical and development priorities. So you may have been, hearing across over the past, few months or years, about sandboxes, but primarily we narrow it down to a niche, which is, using sandboxes particularly, for economic policy making. So I'm going to give some, research review about the background of how we're able to, answer some of these questions. And our central guiding question was looking at how AI sandboxes, can serve as a practical framework for integrating ethical and responsible AI into Africa's policy, economic, and technological systems, to drive inclusivity and sustainable economic transformation. So to answer this question, we took, a mixed method approach, and we started from doing some desk reviews of regulatory sandboxes, models that currently exist globally, from the past and the present, and ranging from the UK to Singapore, to Mauritius to Rwanda. And this, through our research, we're able to identify, the legal, institutional, and technical design principles that underpin, successful sandboxing, which we'll be discussing on this call. And in addition to this, we also conducted some stakeholder interviews. We spoke to some regulators, we spoke to policymakers, we spoke to industry experts. And through this conversation, we were able to identify opportunities, but also, the hesitations and the challenges, that some African institutions face. And maybe, for example, it could be, limited technical expertise, it could be fragmented regulatory frameworks, it could be resource constraints even. This is not new to us. That emerge as, recurring themes across, various organizations. The furthermore, we conducted case studies, especially fintech sandboxes in Africa, which, is very, very predominant. We looked at South Africa's intergovernmental, fintech working group. We looked at Mauritius Economic, Development Board Sandbox. We looked at, Remote Sandbox in Kigali International Financial Center. And all of this, various perspectives provided us, various perspectives and valuable lessons. And from this, triangulation process, we came to a conclusion that sustainable sandboxes require three things, right? The first is transparent governance, which, defines the roles and ensures accountability, the foundation. The second is, clear legal, framework that balances flexibility and safeguards. And also finally, financial viability, which is often achieved through, hybrid funding models that combine government budgets with private sector contributions. And what does this mean in practice? It means that sandboxes may not be, merely spaces for testing algorithms, right? They can become like a lab for governance, a place where policymakers and innovators can learn in real time and correct missteps along the way and, build trust. And for Africa, primarily, regulatory capacity, often lags behind technological adoption, as we all know. So this governance learning function may perhaps be like very, very critical for us to learn across board. And additionally, through the chapter process, we were able to undergo some peer reviews where we also got questions from different experts, which also guided the trajectory of the paper. So to my next slide, what really underpinned or where did we start from was looking at like conceptual framework, which is the TIS, which is the Technological Innovation System. And to frame our analysis, we adopted...
Sorry, Olamide, we can't hear you.
Oh. Can you hear me now?
Seem to have lost your audio.
Oh, I can hear him online.
I can hear you too. It's very clear from my side.
Yes.
Still nothing.
Interesting.
Oh, I think we can't hear you, Zikusiso.
Somebody just spoke.
Blaise and I think Daniel also mentioned it.
Still can't hear you.
I hear him very clearly, so I don't know if I think the problem is other guys, but it's very clear from my side.
Yeah.
Let me drop a message in the chat.
Oh, please proceed, Olamide. I think it might be on our end. I'll just try and because I see Blaise saying yes.
Yes. So I think I will just go ahead. I think I just started the conceptual framework. So I think, like I mentioned, we framed this using the TIS system or the framework. And this framework is widely used in academia, it's widely used in policy research, mainly because it emphasizes that innovation is systemic. And major technologies do not evolve in isolation. They grow substantially, through interaction with users, with actors, with institutions, with policies, and particularly also with markets. And in the case of AI, what does this mean? It means like this systemic lens is very, very, important, especially in the case for Africa. And it is not like a standalone tool. It requires infrastructure, data infrastructures, and technical infrastructures. It requires skill, ecosystems, expertise. It requires legal frameworks, strategies and policies to guide data protection frameworks, and it requires a collaborative network to make sure it is very, very effective. And firms, universities, policymakers, and all end users play a critical role in shaping its trajectory. And so by applying the TIS framework, we highlighted two important insights. And the first is Africa's innovation challenge is not primarily technical; it's a systemic. And the continent does not lack creativity or entrepreneurial energy. We do not lack the talent or brain drain because they're so we have like the youngest population in the world. And what may often be lacking is like an enabling ecosystem, the network of governance, of resources that allow innovation to mature responsibly. And secondly, AI introduces new forms of risk, as we all know, that make a systemic approach even more urgent, right? And to consider the categories of risk identified by the AU Continental AI Strategy, environmental risks of data centers, systemic risk, such as privacy violations, such as cybercrime, or structural risks like job displacement or like a deepening inequality, and even cultural risks such as the erosion of indigenous knowledge and democratic values, which is why a sandbox that is designed with the TI's framework in mind is therefore becomes more than a regulatory tool, and it is like it ends up being an adaptive governance system where a platform where diverse actors can co-create the rules, they can test applications, and they can generate like a continuous feedback loop to enable innovation. And this allows Africa, to align with global AI advances, making it contextual specific, of course, with local needs, whilst mitigating, the specific risks that may come, that will undermine trust and legitimacy. So this conceptual framework is very simple, but yeah, very vital. As innovation in Africa must be, treated as, networked, as a collaborative process, and not in isolation. So sandboxes, when they are designed correctly, they can embody this accurately, and they create like a safe space where actors can experiment together, regulators can adapt in real time, and ethical safeguards are built into the system from the ground up. So moving on to my next slide, then we end up with regulatory sandboxes. So primarily sandboxes are in two folds. There's operational sandbox and there's regulatory sandbox. And we will be focusing on regulatory sandbox in this. It constitutes the governance, technical, then the economic, dimension. And what will this practice? Regulatory sandboxes can then be broken down, into three key dimensions, like I mentioned: governance, the technical, and maybe the financial or economic, viability. So, firstly, looking at the governance, sandboxes must then be anchored, in robust institutional frameworks. And what does this mean? This means, clearly establishing rules about who can participate, and how long testing runs, how the results are evaluated, and a proper governance framework involves defining accountability, which means who is responsible for ethical breaches, and how liability is assigned. And without this clarity in mind, sandboxes then risk becoming, like a toothless exercise. So it is important to set the foundation, which is the governance. Then moving on to the technical design, this includes things such as infrastructure, it includes things such as like processes that enable safe experimentation. And ideally, sandboxes can be physical or they can be digital. So it's good to also have this in mind. And they may involve data sets to test early stage AI models or innovation, or even data for more advanced applications. And the technical design then requires data protection protocols. If you're using African owned data, it requires guidelines for transparency and like a sure or secure criteria for evaluating the models, which are the metrics. And what does this mean for Africa, where capacity constraints are real? It means like developing the already existing pools of technical experts, and this is also inclusive in government organizations, through partnerships with academia or the private sector, which I find very, very essential. So the finally, which is somewhat also the most important, is the financial and economic considerations. As we all know, projects or even sandboxes cannot rely solely on short-term grants or donors. They must be designed with sustainability in mind, and this will involve performance-based funding models where disbursements of these funds are tied to milestones, maybe even cost sharing, where schemes that reduce the burden on government while incentivizing private participation. And this, and even maybe nominal fees for innovators, which will encourage inclusivity as well. And most importantly, sandboxes should not be tied to should be tied, sorry, to broader economic policy objectives, such as job creations. This should be like what should be in mind, such as financial inclusion, such as maybe even tax revenue optimization. And what really makes AI sandboxes somewhat distinct from maybe traditional fintech sandboxes will be the scope and the focus which they're designed. I think my colleague Blaise will discuss further on this, but looking at while fintech sandboxes typically test financial products, mobile money, and all sorts, AI sandboxes in its scope should deal with general purpose technologies that cuts across multiple sectors, looking at health, looking at education, looking at agriculture, looking at governance, and so much more. So this breadth or range means they will require cross agency coordinations amongst different governmental institutions in country. This will mean the Data Protection Commission of the country working with the Ministry of Finance, working with the Ministry of Agriculture, and so on and so forth. And the value of all this is like AI sandboxes will not only serve as a testing technology, it will rely on co-learning processes, where regulators, innovators, policymakers, gain insights from each other. And they also will be like anticipatory tools where they will allow for to identify risks very early on, to adapt frameworks and also build capacity before technology scales. So for Africa, this will mean the regulatory capacity and the technical expertise, which are uneven. This will encourage proactive steps to be taken on all fronts, and where collaboration approach is like a very, very major necessity. So I think I will move on to the next slide. Yes, over to you, Blaise. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Olamide. At this stage, we want to dive into AI sandboxes. And we looked at different components of building AI or implementing AI sandboxes from both the policy, technical, and economic perspectives, as Olamide highlighted. And for AI development, and the relevance is that it is crucial to have AI sandboxes because they play or help in regulators to identify the governance mechanisms, technical systems, and the financial and knowledge gaps. So with the fast-paced nature of AI, it is becoming complex, and governments or stakeholders need to, be abreast with all the nuances of AI development. And so there may be skills gaps, financial gaps, and governance challenges. And so the sandboxes provide that opportunity for cross-learning and engaging the private sector to identify how regulations or AI should be applied to different sectors and what governments need to do. And so the controlled environment for testing models is very good, but offers a learning platform, building financial models, and even how this will play out in the market is also very important. For the private sector, it gives them the opportunity to anticipate the market dynamics and what users will look out for. For governments, they get to look at the potential risks or challenges with these models in the controlled or in the testing environment before they are finally rolled out in the market. And so, yes, this process brings about collaboration and between the agencies and innovators, which is very critical and always missing in the way we adopt and advance innovations. And that process would also become important for creating common goals and charting a common pathway for AI adoption in Africa. And also it helps with risk mitigation, so that instead of waiting for the harm to be done and then we go with a punitive measure, which is usually the case in Africa, we anticipate and mitigate the potential risks from the sandbox implementation process. And so it gives everybody a bird's eye view of what the potential issues could be, and then we can mitigate these even from the start before it is rolled out in the market. And these are critical elements of bringing about responsible and ethical AI solutions to the market. In terms of even government to government relations, is very important. Government to citizens, this is also important before we roll out any large-scale AI solutions, especially in the health sector, for instance. You need to understand some of the potential issues and nuances so that we can mitigate these before a lot of patients get affected. And so sandboxes, are important or relevant looking at these dimensions. And for Africa, it is more important because we are behind in terms of the infrastructure, the skills, and the frameworks. The foundational systems are still at the nascent stages, and this process is very important to make that holistic. Next slide, Olamide. So we looked at some global best practices to inform also the AI sandbox processes that we should adhere to. Most of them looked at sandbox processes in UK, Singapore, but also in Colombia that were advancing some form of AI or digital sandbox implementation for technology advancement. We also looked at traditional versus upcoming AI sandboxes, which you see the AI becoming broader in scope and also focusing on ethical standards. For the country-based reviews, we've seen some best practices in developing sector-based AI sandboxes, whilst other countries are looking at a holistic sandbox that caters for all sectors. So in some cases, the health sector is allowed to operate their sandbox, and the same for agri, education, and similarly. And some other countries just have a single sandbox process where all solutions are tested through that funnel. And also the need for cross-agency coordination and adaptive governance also became important. All right, next slide. In Africa, Africa has made strides in terms of fintech sandboxes, and we think that there were some useful lessons from that, to inform AI sandboxes. And generally, what we see is there's been a layered approach to building effective sandboxes and roadmap systems. Some of the commonalities we see across these three countries, which I would say were pioneers in the fintech sandbox processes, but let me emphasize that other countries have done some form of fintech sandbox implementations, but these we consider as the top and most advanced. And most sandboxes would have a common purpose, which I think should also align with AI sandboxes, which we have highlighted, that it should foster AI innovation, as we saw in the case of the fintech, but by providing, safe and controlled environments. And the fintech experimentation was an example to ensure that before financial tools are rolled out, there is some sandboxing process to understand the regulatory challenges, to avoid fraud and other issues, and also even loss of funds by depositors, especially with digital tools where the government doesn't have enough skills. We saw that with blockchain-based solutions in some of the countries like Mauritius, where sandboxing was used to help regulators and the innovators all come to a common agreement on how to deploy some of these solutions. And so the purpose is important to define that clearly and align it with national goals. There's also the flexibility, and that is the essence of most sandboxes, to bring in some degree of flexibility for the participating firms and stakeholders to have some minimal deployment testing of their solutions, right, in the real market. And in this stage, you see the rules are relaxed in a bit for stakeholders to play and understand the challenges. And even with Togo and most of the sandbox solutions that my colleague talked about, that Asset is doing in South Africa, in Togo and Nigeria, we've seen that come to play in practice, where we were not required to follow the strict data protection rules in most of our AI simulation and sandbox projects, but giving us some flexibility and working with the regulators to understand the challenges before the government rolls it out. And at the latter stage, you would then bring in the regulators to make sure everything is well done. Then the focus is also clear. For most countries, there was the focus on financial inclusion. And so for AI, it is important for governments or stakeholders to define the focus or the goal of the sandbox, so that everybody's committed and willing to participate in the process. But however, there were some differences which are also important. We see South Africa prioritizing financial inclusion, system efficiency, but also within a highly regulated environment. And there were heavy frameworks by the Reserve Bank, and also making sure the PAS get enough or many innovations as much as possible. But not every innovation was, taken to the sandbox, right? Some were rejected from the start to say, we don't see this as relevant for the process. And so you also need to define which kinds of innovation should go through the sandbox so as not to waste everybody's time. If there are existing regulations to deal with it, you don't admit those companies into the process. But in some other countries, it is open for all, and all companies that apply within the window or on a rolling basis are accepted. Mauritius, looking to be a regional fintech hub, for which it is focusing on collaboration and flexibility, but also attracting international firms. And that's one thing that Mauritius has been known for, being competitive internationally as a fintech zone. And so the sandbox provided that opportunity for domestic and foreign innovators to take advantage and quickly roll out innovations in areas that policy or regulation is gray, and the sandboxing provided an opportunity to quickly assess some of these innovations, develop immediate or short-term regulations or guidelines for their operationalization. Rwanda integrated its sandbox into the International Financial Center with, they were looking at a cohort-based testing and model, whilst countries like South Africa would have a rolling basis. So you can apply at any time. Some countries have a window where they make a call for companies to come and participate in the sandbox process. Next slide. We're then looking at some policy recommendations or pathways for doing that. And one is to build future-proof, what we call, future-proof ethical governance and regulatory frameworks. And the tenets of this process should be that they should be anticipatory, right, and responsible to institutional setup and changing dynamics. AI by the day is changing. Large language models were, the trend of yesterday. Today, we are seeing AI agents all coming up. Within a short window, governments would have to adjust and respond to these changes. And so sandboxing in our approach, in our thinking, is a way to bring about anticipatory governance processes. And so if the government had a sandboxing process, immediately AI agents became the trend. The sandbox process allows them the opportunity to anticipate potential governance challenges that would come and respond appropriately. Then for regulations to be future-proof and ethical, we also need to have an inside-out, what we call inside-out multinational stakeholder collaboration. Inside-out means it must first start within the government themselves, becoming aware and responsible to the situation. And then with that capacity internally, they can outwardly also collaborate with multinational firms and other stakeholders in the process to build the right AI sandboxes or regulatory sandboxes, because AI, as my colleague said, has a global and domestic dimensions, and it's important to look inside out, see within you what are the challenges, but externally, what are the influencing factors that can affect AI adoption. And also align objectives with development goals. But having regulatory clarity is also very important, because you need to define the guidelines or the boundaries where where participants have the flexibility and where they don't. And so an example is, if you are deploying an AI model, you need to know to what extent they can test that within the sandboxing process, and where they should not venture into. These needs to be clear, and the liabilities and the responsibilities within the AI regulatory sandbox processes well defined, so that if any party goes beyond these limits, they are liable for whatever they do. This ensures ethical standards and also stakeholders being responsible even within the sandboxing process. It also reduces abuse. And the next broader policy intervention is creating a very robust AI sandbox architecture in the creation, design, and implementation of it. And we are proposing adoption of platformatization, what we call platformatization of AI regulatory sandboxes, which basically means designing two phases of the process, right? That we can build these platforms to make that possible. And the platforms basically means creating the opportunity using technical infrastructure that support data pipelines all coming in, provides regulatory insights within the sandbox. So phase one, we posit that should be a minimal regulatory requirements. At this stage, as I said, keep saying it gives some minimal regulatory restrictions, but also limited scope to what the innovation testing can be or the policy test can be. And phase two should be maybe a fully regulated AI sandboxing for high-risk innovations. So after the phase one, if the policymakers or the stakeholders come to realize this is a low-risk innovation, they can pass and allow the innovation to operate in the real world. But for high-risk innovation, we are proposing the second phase, which then has stricter regulations, more regulatory insights, and investments by all stakeholders to make sure the process is sustainable. Also, there's a need for technical toolkits and guidelines for the regulatory process. And here we bring in the state capacity, which is very important, to build their ability to understand the sandbox process and run it efficiently. Designing toolkits and guidelines is important, and this could be sector-based, and making it possible that each sector has the capacity to do so, and applying these to the relevant situation. And so know-how is important. For instance, data officers are important in the process. You need cybersecurity personnel. And so integrating these even at various departments across government is important, and they can support sandbox processes, especially where you need a private sector to participate. This is very important. Next slide. Then we also proposing that, and we've seen this across countries, these things, systems or frameworks do fail because there isn't enough support or budgetary funding for it in the long run. And for sustainability, they need to define, there's a need to clarify or bring clarity to the budgetary funding and private sector support for this. And we proposing an outcome-based rewards for economic models for continuous monitoring and evaluation. So whilst companies are in the sandbox, or if they are performing well and contributing to the process, there should be some rewards or outcomes based incentives for stakeholders to continue to operate with it. And funding mechanisms that bring sustainability are important. And for instance, charging some fees for sandbox operations should be considered. Government could also monetize open data pipelines from government. So a government, as part of the sandbox process, can say, we are committing to bringing most of our data, anonymized data with all the ethical standards from different sectors into the sandbox. And so companies that use these pipelines to test pay some fees and are dispersed to maintain the platform, and to other stakeholders that are putting in time and effort into this. It is important to keep oiling this process. If not, it will grind to a halt one day. And so that is an important step to do in this, and making sure, even if it's donor funded, sustainability should be built into the process in the long term. And I think governments can also use sandboxes to monetize data, and get the private sector engaged in the process. Also linking it to economic policymaking is important. And economic policymaking, in our opinion, is also a way to make sure we generate income and wealth within the citizens. And so if we can bring sandboxes that encourage innovations to come and support us make relevant and efficient economic policies, also it's a great way to generate more resources, spend on social infrastructure, but also bring about ethical innovation, so that AI sandboxes can bring a better way to target for poverty targeting, but also developing solutions, like in the case of South Africa, that allows us to monitor economic activities in an ethical and responsible way. And as I'm sure you must have heard this, but regional coordination is important, and collaboration for the sandbox processes. There's no need to create any new frameworks. There are existing regional bodies, which we believe provisions in these bodies can be activated to support sandbox operationalization. The AU, EACA, ECOWAS, and SADC are all relevant and pivotal to the process. AFCA is an example, and I believe there are some processes for data flows that we can use. Sandboxes can also be cross-border, and so this is why we are stressing the importance of collaborations. We've only seen national sandboxes, but at some point there should be regional sandboxes that allow for instance, testing cross-border mobile money transfer is an approach that most countries, no country has done that across the continent, but sandboxing could be a way. And so leveraging the regional protocols could allow for this process to go on and make it easier for broader financial inclusions, trade payments with AI, and making the continent a bit smarter and agents that support cross-border transactions. But this will require some form of support, and existing regulations play a role. And again, here phase 2, we can look at how to do that. Legislative compatibility is important if we need to go cross-border. And we can also, for countries that are interested, they can be bilateral relationships in this regard to test some of these things, and then bring on board other regional members to join in this regard. I think, next one, these are some of the recommendations that we set forth, and hope the book chapter is trying to say and really emphasize the need for these frameworks, AI sandbox regulatory frameworks, to be embedded into our AI development process and provide a broader perspective, a more ethical, responsible framework, but making it sustainable for everyone to understand the AI evolution, the development, but more especially bringing on board the private sector, so that the two don't operate in silos, and it will create a common understanding. And broadly, it's an easy way for public sector stakeholders to also learn about AI development. And so instead of maybe spending time in taking boring courses, participating in sandboxes in a practical way also supports that. And we've seen that in the asset projects in Togo, Nigeria, and South Africa, where government stakeholders are now beginning to learn about some of the nuances of AI. For instance, we just got some of the females in the Ministry of Finance in Togo through a course in AI and gender policy, and they participated in the sandbox. Most of them are beginning to express how they have broadened their understanding of the practical challenges and also opportunities in developing AI tools and adopting them within government. And so they are useful lessons, and it reduces most of the risks, faster learning, but in a practical way, and also enhancing a safer deployment of AI tools. And the last one also is the infrastructure, right? You have the technical transfer, and we're also beginning to see how the government stakeholders are learning about the technical requirements for hosting AI solutions, which also can be expensive, but from the government side provides them with the ability to learn and deploy these things. And whether it should be on-premise, it should be in the cloud, these are all things that we are all learning through the sandboxing and simulation processes across the countries. And the experiences are different from country to country, and also based on what you are doing with the sandboxes. And so that is why with multiple use cases going through the sandboxes, it will enhance more learning, more detection of ethical issues, and building very much robust regulations and policies to drive innovation, but protect everybody in the AI revolution in Africa. Thank you. And we are open to take questions or comments as well, feedback that is relevant. We're happy to take that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, colleagues. I think we can open it up to questions, yes. Any questions in the room or online? We can drop them off. Sorry, yeah. So in the room, we also have our colleague Paul from HSRC. I tried to switch on our camera, but it's too wide. But yeah, go for it, Paul.
Thanks very much for the presentation. A really interesting, comprehensive. I'm just wondering from my side, what specific aspects of economic policy making do you think would be considered risky or requiring regulation that would be important for testing in a sandbox environment? So I think we're more used to sandboxes being used for, say, technology-related projects where you can see a quite direct potential harm that needs to be regulated, and then you want to use a sandbox environment to explore that and consider how regulations might be adjusted. I'm just wondering, in the context of economic policy making, what specific types of regulatory questions would you want to explore, consider in a sandbox?
Right, I'll take that, and my colleague can also come in. One example would be, I would say, in times of crisis, you need regulatory sandboxes. I'll still come to the specific questions of areas that you can look at, but crisis is one of them. And during the time of COVID, we saw an example or similar cases where sandboxing processes were used to help government adequately respond to the needs of the time. In Togo, there was the use of a sandbox process together with the telecommunications companies to allow them use geolocation data to send interventions to poor households during the times of the lockdown. So that was an example. I think the project was called Novisa together with the World Bank. And so it relaxed some of the regulatory processes, allowed the telecommunications companies to use that data, and the government and development partners were able to provide these interventions to poor households that were unable to work because of the lockdown. So that's an example in times of crisis or emergencies. Other emerging policies interventions could be, of late, we are also seeing the debt challenges that has come across to many countries. And Sandboxes also allows, in a way, countries are able to use that to simulate, at this time, the impact of their debt programs, restructuring, and how that affects, their national economic stability. Also, how do they balance the policies or the fiscal and monetary policies in terms of taxes? Which sectors now should they tax more because the citizens are overburdened because of the increase in debt, right? We are also seeing AI for tax benefit simulations in this regard. But I would also say new areas, for instance, which we're also doing with the Reserve Bank, where we need regulatory clarity, is using satellite imagery to real-time monitor national and cross-border economic movement. So that is, for me, is also an area where you need a sandboxing is important to help you develop the regulatory systems, because we are used to picking up survey data and analyzing it. But this time, if you are using satellite and object data, that brings in the new dimension of space, bringing that into economic policy, privacy concerns. But where do you strike the balance in terms of making sure it is used for proper economic analysis and helping the bank and stakeholders to respond in real time, versus also using it for ethical and unethical purposes, targeting slums and poor homes and others, right? So we think these are some areas where AI sandboxes play a role in helping stakeholders to make economic progress with policies, but also having regulations that safeguard the process. I hope that provides some clarity.
Yeah, thank you. That's great.
Thank you so much. Any other questions?
But let me also say, sorry, for the previous question, if there are other perspectives that I haven't addressed and you feel it's important, please feel free to share, as this is a learning platform.
Yes. All right. I think if there are no questions, we can close it off here. Thank you once again, Blaise and Olamide, for affording us your time and for presenting today at the Tayarisha Lunchbox series. I see we do have a question from Diana. Please go ahead, Diana.
No, sorry, my apologies. I wanted to say thank you. No, not again.
All right. All right. So our next Lunchbox session will be on the 6th of November. Please keep an eye out for an invite from me. Thank you so much, colleagues. Have a good day further.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for having us.
Yeah.